Okay, for our next Bible study, we're going to be looking at John chapter 14, a very familiar passage of Scripture, and especially that is a passage that's read in many times at funerals, and we'll be seeing that in a minute. And we're continuing the subject or topic of symbols or symbolism. And we've been showing you, we looked at Psalm 121, we looked at Revelation 19, we've looked at Revelation 4. We'll look at John 14 today with the symbolism, and then we'll look at Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones. You'll be sure that you want to listen to that one because there's a lot of question about the valley of dry bones. What if God were to tell you to go preach to a cemetery? Go at midnight and preach to all the bones in the cemetery. Would you do it? Well, we'll be looking at that. We'll be telling you what that passage means with its symbolism. Now, John 14, we're going to look at, I'm going to read a couple of verses from the Good News Bible, which I do use a lot. It's what you call a paraphrase. To me, it's very, very helpful. I have enjoyed it a great deal. It's not one of the major translations, but we try to give you different study tools in our Bible studies here because we want you to be studying the Bible for yourself, and that's what we try to recommend. Some of these different study tools, and I've got several that I'll be looking at tonight. All right, so we'll look at John 14. Now, with the symbolism here, we always look for remember the reality behind the symbolism, because the reality is more greater than the symbol is itself. So when we talk about symbols, of course, we're saying something that is kind of like represents something else without really saying it. So we can say Jesus is the door, and that's in John 10, I believe, John 9 or 10. Jesus is the door, and we mean by that, he doesn't have to explain, what that means. He just simply gives the symbol. Well, a door is something you go in and out of. You have to have an entrance to get into something with a door. So Jesus doesn't have to explain. He can just use the symbolism, and then we would get the point. So we're going to talk about today the Father's house. He uses the symbolism here of the Father's house. All right? We will pray and ask God to bless us as we open up the Scripture here and to help to show us some of the things here of the symbolism. So, Lord, we ask that you bless us tonight, and as we open up your word, we ask that you bless us, help us understand, get the meaning, but more importantly, see the great symbolism that you have given to us in this passage. And we ask it all in the name of Christ. Amen. Okay, so we are looking at the Father's house. So we'll look at the symbols in this particular passage. And we see several symbols. Okay, he says, in my Father's house are many mansions. That's one symbol that you're going to have to deal with. He talks about a prepared place. I will go and prepare a place for you. Well, why does he have to prepare heaven? If this is heaven, why does he have to prepare it, okay? Has he not been doing the work already all this time? And then he says, I will return and I will come again and receive you unto myself. All right, so there you'll have to deal with that particular symbolism, and I think it's a reality, it's physical. Yes, he will come back, we know that. But there's a lot more symbolism involved than that. All right, so we look at the point of the symbolism in this particular passage, and you're going to say, well, the point is very simple. The point is heaven. And I'm going to say, no. You've missed the point. If you believe this is a reference only to heaven, and that's what he's trying to say, I would have to say you have missed the point or the interpretation. All right, so I'm going to prove that in a minute. All right, the point of the symbolism is not heaven. The point of the symbolism is Jesus. Not heaven, not mansions, but Jesus. You're looking at Jesus. That's what he wants you to do. He doesn't want you to look at heaven. He wants you to look at him. All right, so it's kind of like a little bit of a misnomer because he talks about my Father's house, and we'll see what that means. But the point of the symbolism here, the passage clearly teaches Jesus. And you're always going to look for the main point of a symbol. Okay, so whenever we're studying symbols, we're looking for the primary main point of that particular symbolism. We saw that in Psalm 121. There were a lot of symbols, but we looked for the main point, that God is sovereign over his creation. We looked at Revelation 19. The importance of the main point of the symbolism is that God was coming to judge the nations of the world, the evil, the wicked. And now the symbolism here, we'll look at the symbolism of the Father's house. It's kind of tricky because he's talking about what appears to be heaven, but really it's not emphasis on heaven, it's on him. In other words, wherever he will be, that's where heaven is. Okay, and that's what he's teaching. So this passage does teach a lot about security, of our certainty in Jesus Christ. So if you didn't know anything about that before this message, it should be a blessing to you. It's a passage that deals with the symbolism of fellowship. And we'll see that from Mark chapter 14. It deals with comfort and assurance. He said, let not your heart be troubled. It deals with the presence of Jesus. Okay, the passage teaches that wherever Jesus is, that's where we will be. And I'm going to say that the passage could possibly imply a reunion with loved ones after death. Now, I'm saying that it could be, and I think that's what it says, and maybe even Frank Gabeline thought the same thing. So people sometimes ask the question, will we know our loved ones in heaven? Well, it seems to me like from this passage I can say that in heaven, when we finally get there, that there will be the reunion of loved ones, and I think this passage teaches that. Now, I know you're going to say, prove it to me, because we always want somebody to prove something, right? Well, that's good. We ought to. Because that would stop us from anybody making ridiculous statements without evidence. We thrive on evidence. Everything we do, it should be based on evidence. It's not always the case anymore. But it should be based on evidence. Okay, science is based on facts and evidence. When you have a trial, a jury, it should be based on facts, the evidence. You should look at the facts. Somebody comes up and says, a UFO landed in my backyard last night. Well, I'm gonna say, really? By the way, there was just heard coming up here, and just the other day I think it was on Fox, they had a special that said that the Navy has released pictures which they say are UFOs. You say, well, do you believe in UFOs? I thought only nutcases. Well, you take a look at those pictures, and you let me know. Now, a lot of those could be secret government weapons, possibly. I think that's what a lot of them are. But anyway, somebody says, one of them landed in my backyard last night. Well, I said, well, let me come over to your house, and we'll go out there and we'll look in the yard, and we'll see if there's any oil that's been left over, maybe leaked out of the UFO. Because my car leaks oil, so I don't know about it. When it gets old, it leaks oil. There's evidence my car was there. We'll see if there's any indentations on the ground, like something heavy might have landed on it. Then we'll go next door, we'll talk to the neighbor. Well, were you outside? The neighbor says, yeah, I was sitting on the porch last night. Did you see any UFO land in the backyard of your neighbor's backyard? He says, nah, I didn't see nothing like that. And then he might say, well, what was he drinking last night before when he made that statement? So what you do is you examine the evidence and the facts. So that's what we're doing here. Okay, that's what our point is of Bible interpretation. So really a Bible interpreter is an investigator. You're looking for facts, evidence. If the evidence is not there, you can't claim it to be a fact, okay? Now, the background of this passage, as we know, many people love this passage and they use it. I just heard coming up here that there's the queen's husband that died, that they were using the passage that the pastor used at the sermon was John 11, okay? Jesus said, he that liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Well, that's a common passage that people use, but the passage that's most used that I've heard in going to a funeral is John chapter 14. So let's read those verses. He says, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go and prepare a place for you. So he says, verse 3, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. You notice that? Where I am is where you will be. And verse 4, to prove my point that I just made a statement a minute ago, verse 4, he says, whither I go you will know, and the way you will know. Verse 5, Thomas says, well, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? What does Jesus say? Verse 6, I am the way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Okay? So it's all about him. It's all about him. Okay, verse 7. Verse 8, Philip said unto him, Lord, show us the Father, and we'll be satisfied. It will satisfy. Jesus said, how have I been with you such a time, Philip? Yet hast thou not known me? He that hath seen me has seen the Father. And how are you now saying, show us the Father? You're looking at God. Jesus is his way of saying, I am God. He says, if you believe in God, you also can believe in me. I can't make that statement. You can't make that statement. Sun Myung Moon cannot make that statement. Jim Jones could not. He made the statement many times because he claimed to be God, but he was not God. He died. Okay? He's dead. No cult leader can make that statement. Jesus made a pretty bold statement. I'm the way to God. Well, others have made that statement too, but they weren't the way to God. They were the way to destruction. He says, if you've seen me, you've seen God, Philip. So why are you asking to show you the Father? So those three evidence, okay, prove if it's all about Jesus. It's not about heaven, but the symbolism is here. Let's deal with it now. This was a passage, okay, as we know, is a very familiar passage in sermons we hear at funerals. And we can all identify with the words at some point, right? That's why it's so popular. Let not your heart be troubled. You've had a troubled heart at some point, as all of us do. We all have troubles, okay? We all have heavy hearts, as we sometimes call it. And so yet we can identify with this passage symbolically. All right? This is also a passage in chapter 3 that begins what we call the upper room discourse, where Jesus, remember, washed the feet of the disciples. And that was in chapter 13. So 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, I think. 17 is the prayer, the unity prayer. This is dealing with what we call the upper room discourse. All right, this is taking place pretty quickly right before the crucifixion of Christ. Now, what is interesting is that there has been a parallel of this event the day before. I'm going to read that to you because I think it shows a little bit about the symbolism here. If you go to chapter 14 of the Gospel of Mark, I'm going to show you that the Passover fellowship right the day before this here was actually, this was a picture of what Jesus is saying here. So if we go to Mark chapter 14, let me read you one or two verses here. All right, chapter 14, I think is verses 12, 13, 14. The first day of unleavened bread, that was the beginning of the Passover. When they killed the Passover, the disciples said unto Jesus, where wilt thou that we go and prepare, do you notice the word prepare, that you may eat the Passover? Notice the word preparation. They were looking for a prepared room. He sends forth two of his disciples, verse 13, and said unto them, go into the city, and there you will meet a man bearing a pitcher of water, and follow him. That would be a sign because that was a woman's job in that culture, to carry the water on the top of their heads. It's not a man's job. So therefore, if a man's doing it, okay, that's a pretty good sign that Jesus is telling them, okay, it's being fulfilled. Wheresoever he shall go, say to the goodman of the house, the master says, where is the guest chamber where I will eat the Passover with my disciples? Notice verse 15. He will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. There make ready for us. Now, what's happening here, this is a miniature picture of the upper room discourse, okay, or the Passover, and what Jesus is saying here about the Father's house. It's a miniature picture of what he's trying to say. So you see, the symbolism is probably much greater than actually the actual words that we're seeing here. So let me clarify that, okay? In this chapter, we see three things. Jesus is returned to the Father. We see the house of many mansions that's described. And then we see the Father's or the Son's return to claim his own. All three of these things really are major points of this passage. So Jesus is returned to the Father. Go back to chapter 14. He says, I will go and prepare a place for you. I am returning to the Father. Could that be why they were sorrowful in their heart? He says, let not your heart be troubled. And they were troubled probably because they knew he was going to leave. He had promised, okay, he is going back to the Father. He is going back to the bosom of the Father where he had come, John 1:18. So he says, let not your heart be troubled. I'm going back to the Father. And Jesus would be crucified to the sorrow of the disciples. But he said, believe in God and believe in me. I will show you the way, and I will show you the way to the Father. Now, at least two times he had made this statement in verses 10 and 11. Again, so you wouldn't miss the point. He says, the words that I speak unto you, I speak not of myself, but the Father that dwells in me. He will do the works. Verse 11, believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. All right, so at least three times he makes the equation with the Father. He is equated. The Father is in me, and I am in the Father. But what the passage is going to say is that if you are in Jesus, you are in the Father. You will be in the Father wherever he is, okay? Now, let's look at the symbolism now of the Father's house of many mansions, because that's the key here. In reality, the Father's house, most people realize to be equated with heaven itself. And the symbolism here can be tricky, yes, and it does deal with the Father's house. If you refer to the Father's house as heaven, which is probably what he's trying to say here, even though the temple was called the Father's house, if you remember, when he cleansed the temple, he said, make not my Father's house a house of selling and merchandising and sales and crooked political machinery. So, yeah, the Father's house could have been a reference to the temple. Some people use the terminology in Revelation 19 that we talked about chapter 21 of Revelation. Holy city comes down as prepared as a bride for her bridegroom. So those three things are possibilities when he says, my Father's house. He says, in my Father's house are many mansions. All right? But what is he referring to when he says, my Father's house? Now I'm going to read you something here from the Good News version. And I think this was good. In chapter 14, okay, let's read the verses here, 1 to 3. He says, do not be worried and upset, he said. Jesus told them, believe in God, believe also in me. Now notice what he says here, a little bit different than King James. There are many rooms in my Father's house, and I'm going to prepare a place for you. Maybe prepare one of those rooms. I would not tell you this if it were not so. And after I go and prepare one of those rooms or place for you, I will come back and take you to myself, so that you will be wherever I am. So notice again, the emphasis here is not on heaven, it's on him. Because he's promising his disciples that we will be wherever he is, and he is with the Father. He will be with the Father when he returns. But he says, I'm going to prepare a place. So, let's look at the mansion here. He says, in my Father's house are many rooms, abodes. We could say it means abodes. It means dwelling place. It means a translated house here. It means a place of abiding, living. But it's usually translated probably room is probably the better, more accurate definition. Now, I am well aware, coming from a little bit of an independent Baptist background, I remember we went to a funeral one day. I don't remember who it was. Somebody that was associated with somebody at the school. And the preacher got up and read from one of these translations, and he says, in my Father's house are many rooms. Well, I had some independent Baptist classmates with me at the time, and when they heard that, they were very, very offended about what the pastor said, many rooms. And they would actually they said, he's trying to take my mansion away from me. That's what they said. I heard them. I was with them. We'd gone to a funeral. The preacher used those words, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. And they thought, well, this must be a liberal pastor. He's a liberal pastor. He doesn't believe the Bible. He doesn't believe the King James Version, so he's a liberal pastor. And he's trying to take my mansion that Jesus promised me away. Well, I kind of felt like that at the time because I didn't know any better. I was just starting out. I was just a young Christian. I hadn't really studied this for myself, and I was just listening to what they were saying. Well, when I began to do a little study for this in college, I taught this class and I taught the book of John. I found out that the pastor was right. The pastor was actually right. This is a reference to rooms, abodes, dwelling places, okay? It's not necessarily about a mansion. Now, I'm not trying to take your mansion away from you. You talk to God about that. I can't promise you a mansion. If Jesus promised you a mansion, then you take that up with him. But I don't really think that's what he's trying to say. He is trying to say here, in my Father's house, which is a veil reference to heaven, pretty clear here. Not veil, pretty open. So the Father's house here is a reference to basically heaven. But it's more than that. There's much more than just going to heaven that this passage is teaching. For example, in my Father's house are rooms, abodes, dwelling places, where you live. Now you think about your own house as a place of comfort, security, fellowship if you have someone living with you in the house. If you're single, you don't. But the house does symbolize a lot of things. And maybe that's what Hunter was talking about in his passage here when he writes, because he brought this out very, very clearly. It looks as if here Jesus has made the disciples' journey of the previous day we just read into a parable of eternity, in which the upper room, where they were observing the Passover, foreshadows the home of God with its many habitations. Now, I thought that was an incredible observation he's made. I wish I had made it. I did not. He did. A.M. Hunter wrote the commentary. But he's pointing out here that that was a miniature picture of the Father's house or eternity, because there is a room prepared. Exactly what Jesus is saying here. And we know that a house of, let's just say our house, your house, is a house of comfort, fellowship, security, safety, and love. Now also, let's keep in mind here when we think of the Oriental house of that culture, most of the people that were very poor people, they didn't have houses like we do today. They had one room, usually a house of Oriental culture, of that culture, usually had one room. And everybody didn't have their own personal bedroom like we do today. You have the children, they have their own bedrooms. Grandma has her bedroom. Grandpa has his bedroom. The dog has his own dog house. The animals have their own bedrooms. In that culture, there was only one room. But the unique thing is that everybody was in that one room. And that's maybe what he's trying to say here. So maybe this is kind of like a picture of a one-room Oriental house or culture of that day. And exactly that is what Frank Gabeline said. And here's what Gabeline says. He says, and I thought this was very important. The imagery of a dwelling place or rooms is taken from the Oriental house in which the sons and daughters have apartments under the same roof as their parents in the house, in the one room. Now, you think about that for a minute. If that was a one-room house, and Jesus is picturing that as many rooms or many abodes or many dwelling places, could it possibly be that he's insinuating that there could be a reunion of loved ones and family in that one house with many rooms or dwelling places? You see, if you're arguing for only heaven, you've missed the whole point. You've missed the emphasis here of the dwelling and the abiding. So if that analogy is correct and Gabeline is true or correct, then it could possibly mean a reference or a reunion with loved ones in heaven one day. But the point is, okay, of the dwelling places and the abiding places here, the dwelling rooms, he's not trying to say that you have a mansion bigger than I do and my mansion is better than yours, or that's not what he's trying to say. He's trying to get the point that wherever I am, I will be with the Father, I will be with the Father, and you will be with me with the Father. And it will be the Father's house. Now, the third point here, and we'll close, and then we'll kind of draw this together with the symbolism of the passage. He says, I will come again and receive you unto myself, John 14. He says, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you will be also. See, the point is about him. It's all about him. It's not about a mansion or how big your mansion is or how much property you have or anything like that. If that's all you see from this passage, you're missing the whole point of the passage. Now, the coming again, and then we'll close. The presence with God, basically, when he comes and he receives those, we will be with him from that point on. We will be with him and he will be with God. Now, this passage could refer to only one or two things, okay? We see it's his second coming, and it's the only place in the entire book of John that I see that is a reference to his second coming. But I think it's more likely a reference to the rapture of the church, or we call the parousia. Sometimes it's translated second coming, but this is not the same passage that we would see in Revelation 19, which we've already looked at. There is nothing described in this passage that we see in Revelation 19, where Jesus comes back on a white horse. He smites the nations with the sword, comes out of his mouth. He has blood all the way up to his neck on the garments because of the massacre. He's judged the nations. Nothing like that here. That's why we believe, okay, this passage of the rapture is different than the second coming. But he says, okay, I will receive you and I will come again. So obviously, here is a picture of the rapture of the church, I believe, no question. Now, let me just also kind of give you this before we close. That in Jewish culture, you have to understand how a wedding is performed and a wedding takes place. Because I believe what he's saying here is wedding symbolism. I believe that Jesus is using wedding terminology. He's using Jewish wedding terminology, which we're not familiar with. So that's why we need to study customs and cultures in the Bible. We need to study about the customs, because that's what he's describing here. But in a Jewish wedding, what they would do, the bridegroom would pay a price for his bride. He would claim his bride, or the father sometimes would arrange the marriage. Now, that was something that happened in that culture. You see that in Samson. The book of Judges, Samson says to his parents, he said, I see a woman and I want her. Well, I wish it had been that easy for me when I was growing up to just tell my parents, that's the woman I want. Wouldn't have done any good. But in that culture, that was sometimes the parents arranged the marriages. So he would pick out the one he wanted, and the parents would arrange the marriage, and then he would pay the price to the father of the bride. And he would pay the price, okay, whatever the price was, whatever the price was asking. And so he made the payment, and the marriage wouldn't take place right then. They had what they call betrothal periods in the Bible, but they were binding agreements. Unlike today, we have people say we're a premarital state. Well, that was not kind of what the Bible. That's not the way it was. They had the marriage was arranged, and you would pay the price, yes, but the marriage was a binding contract. But there was no sexual relations at that point until the marriage was consummated. So that means, okay, there could have been a year. He makes the payment for the bride. That's the one he wants. He makes the payment for her, and then what he does is he goes back and he gets his house. He prepares the room or the house for his bride. So when he goes back and claims his bride, he takes her back to his prepared house or room. Now, it could have been a house of his own, or it could have been a room on the father's house. But what would happen, according to Zola Levitt's book, A Christian Love Story? Zola Levitt was a famous teacher, Jewish, and this is where one of the greatest things that I ever heard him say, he explained how a Jewish wedding works. He says what would happen is this, he would go back and he would prepare for his wife and his bride. So when he went back to consummate the marriage, and there would be a ceremony, as you know the story, they would go, and many times he would go claim his bride at a time where she wasn't expecting him to come. She didn't know when he's coming. She had to be ready all the time, because he could come at any moment. He could come at midnight. He could come at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he would go through, there would be a parade through the streets, processions, because he's going to claim his bride. But he comes, and she doesn't know when he's coming. So he comes, and he goes through the streets with a great procession. There's the voice, the cry, "Behold, the bridegroom cometh. Go you out to meet him." And so therefore he would come, he would claim his bride, and he would take her back to his house where they would consummate the marriage. But the important thing here about this ceremony is something that we sometimes don't know. According to Zola Levitt's little book, A Christian Love Story, he says it was the father's decision as to when the house was ready. The father made that decision. And so the man is waiting. It could be a year, could be 6 months, could be 2 years. He's waiting for the bride he's purchased. And now it's time, okay, he's got the house ready. He's prepared the house. And now it's time for him to go get the bride. But according to Zola Levitt, it was not his decision to make. It was the father's decision to make. The father looks at the house. Now, if I were going to get married, I would probably go throw up a shack in one day. Probably anybody else would too. If my bride was waiting on me, I wouldn't wait a year or 6 months to prepare a house. I'd throw up something and go get her. That's not the way it worked. The father looks at the prepared house and the room or whatever, and he says he makes sure it's inspected. He inspects it, makes sure it's prepared and ready. And according to Zola Levitt's little book, he says, now it's time for you to go get your bride. The father made the decision. It's time for you to go get the bride. And so that's when he would go back and claim his bride. But that really made sense to me when I read and remembered Jesus' statement. If you remember, I think it's in Mark chapter 13, verse 32. Jesus said about his return, if you remember what he said, the angels don't know, I don't know, only the Father knows when I will return. That's what he said. Bible critics and Bible scholars and all those critics and all those who question the Bible said, you see, even Jesus doesn't know. He doesn't know everything. He doesn't know when he's going to return. That proves he's not God. But wait a minute. If he's using the wedding symbolism and the terminology, which I think he's doing here, yes, he does know. But he's using that symbolism of the Father. Why? Because they would understand it better. Now, you're saying, okay, that's pretty good. Now, think about that, though. Jesus prepares the place, and he comes back for his bride. That's the believers. That's us. And he takes his bride. He takes it back to his prepared house. Now, in that prepared house, it'll be a place where the family is, a one-room house or dwelling place, maybe more. But it's where the entire family will be reunited again. Now, you think about that. But think about the symbolism here of the Father's house. It's not just heaven. If that's all you see, or a mansion, you've missed the whole point. The house is the place that's where we live. We live in our home. We'll close with this. When I'm out anywhere and I come home late at night and I drive up in my driveway, you've been traveling before, and all of a sudden you turn down your street and you going down the street and you turn in your driveway and maybe the lights are on if somebody's there. If you're alone, sometimes you leave the lights on. You see the lights in the house on. And it gives the indication somebody's here. But you drive up into your driveway and you realize and finally say, and you know, I'm home. It's a long day. At the end of the day, I have now arrived home. But when you get into the house, you think, well, you have security in your house. You lock the doors. You can take off your clothes, put your bathrobe on, or whatever you want to put on in the comfort of your house. So a house is a place of comfort. A house is a place of loved ones if you are with a family or wife, husband. And so you get to the house, okay, at the end of the day, you have the family is there, you have security is there, you have assurity is there, comfort is there, fellowship is there. And you say, finally, okay, you go into the house, you shut the door, and you say, I am finally home. Well, I think that's what Jesus is saying here, and this is what this passage is about. You finally arrived home, but it's not just an empty house. It's a prepared place. And I'm here, the Father's here, but all of your loved ones are here too. So I don't know of anything or any passage that has a greater symbolism than to know, okay, our destiny as believers is just as secure as Jesus is with the Father.